The room was filled with the quiet hum of condolences as Sarah, an 8-year-old with tear-streaked cheeks, stood clutching her father's hand. The funeral had begun, and her mother, Lily, was the center of everyone's grief. Lily had been a bright light in their small town, known for her kind smile and unwavering love for her family, but now that light was gone. Ethan, Sarah's father, stood frozen beside her. His face was a mask of controlled sorrow, his grip on Sarah's tiny hand tighter than usual. The wooden coffin, polished to perfection, sat at the front of the room, surrounded by white lilies and framed photographs of Lily. Ethan's heart felt heavier with each passing moment, but his thoughts were fractured. The suddenness of Lily's death left questions he couldn't shake. Sarah looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with confusion and sadness. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why does Mommy have to stay in the box? She didn't like being in small places." Ethan swallowed hard, crouching to meet her gaze. "Mommy's not in the box, sweetheart," he said gently. "That's just where we say goodbye. Mommy's in a better place now." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She tightened her grip on his arm and shook her head. "No, Daddy," she insisted, her voice firmer now. "Mommy's not gone. I saw her last night, in the garden." Ethan froze, the weight of her words settling in his chest like a stone. "Sarah," he began cautiously, "sometimes, when we miss someone a lot, it feels like we can see them, but—" She waved at me, Sarah interrupted, her tone filled with conviction. "She was wearing her blue dress, the one she wore on my birthday. She smiled at me, Daddy. I know it was her." Ethan's breath hitched. The blue dress. It was one of Lily's favorites. He tried to dismiss it as Sarah's way of coping, but deep down, something about her certainty made his hands tremble. He looked toward the coffin, his mind swirling with doubt and fear. As the minister began the eulogy, Ethan's thoughts grew darker. Something wasn't right. The sealed coffin, the rushed arrangements, and now Sarah's insistence that she had seen Lily. He couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in his gut. Something was being kept from him, and he was determined to find out what. The funeral ended in somber silence, with friends and family trickling out of the church. Ethan stayed behind, standing by the coffin as Sarah sat quietly on one of the pews, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. The room now felt cavernous, and the stillness amplified Ethan's unease. As the funeral director approached to begin preparations for the burial, Ethan stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "Wait," Ethan said, his voice edged with suspicion. "Why was the coffin sealed before the service? Isn't that unusual?" The director, a tall, thin man with a practiced air of calm, hesitated for a moment too long. "It was a request from the coroner, Mr. Carter," he replied carefully. "They said it was necessary due to certain conditions." "What conditions?" Ethan pressed, his voice rising slightly. "I wasn't informed of any issues. My wife—" He faltered, his emotions catching up with him. "Lily didn't have any health problems before this. I deserve an explanation." The director shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Ethan's piercing gaze. "I'm afraid I don't have all the details," he said, his tone clipped. "You'd have to speak with the coroner directly." Ethan's frustration boiled over, but before he could push further, Sarah tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy," she said softly, "why are you upset? Mommy wouldn't want you to be sad." Ethan forced a small smile, kneeling to meet her eyes. "I'm not upset, sweetheart," he lied. "I'm just trying to understand everything." But the truth was, he didn't understand. Nothing about Lily's death made sense. She had been vibrant and healthy just days before. The official cause, heart failure, felt hollow, lacking the weight of certainty, and Sarah's insistence that she had seen her mother added a new layer of confusion. That evening, after returning home, Ethan found himself staring at the coroner's report on the kitchen table. The details were sparse, almost evasive, and the lack of clarity gnawed at him. He picked up the phone, dialing the coroner's office. It rang several times before a voice answered. "This is Dr. Martin," the coroner said, his tone neutral but professional. "This is Ethan Carter," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I need to know more about my wife's death. Why was the coffin sealed? What aren't you telling me? There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make Ethan's grip on the phone tighten. Mr. Carter, Dr. Martin began cautiously. I understand your grief, but I assure you everything has been handled according to protocol. That's not an answer, Ethan snapped. My daughter says she saw her mother last night. How do you explain that? Dr. Martin hesitated again before sighing. Grief can affect children in profound ways, he said. It's not uncommon for them to— That's not what I'm asking, Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. Why was the coffin sealed? Another pause, and then Dr. Martin's tone shifted, becoming more guarded. Mr. Carter, I suggest you focus on your family right now. Let the process take its course. The line went dead. Ethan slammed the phone onto the table, his heart pounding. Dr. Martin's evasiveness only deepened his suspicion. Something was being hidden from him. Something he couldn't ignore. Later that night, as Sarah slept soundly in her room, Ethan sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at an old photo of Lily. Her radiant smile seemed to mock him now, as if daring him to uncover the truth. He made a decision then and there. He wouldn't rest until he got answers. The next morning, Ethan was woken by a soft knock on his bedroom door. Daddy, Sarah's small voice called out. He sat up quickly, rubbing his tired eyes. Come in, sweetheart, he said. Sarah entered, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. She looked hesitant, her brows furrowed with worry. Daddy, she whispered. I saw Mommy again last night. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward, his heart pounding. You saw her? Where, Sarah? Tell me everything. Sarah hesitated, her little fingers nervously pulling at her bear's ear. By the garden, she said finally. I woke up and looked out my window. Mommy was there. She smiled at me and waved, but she didn't come closer. Ethan struggled to maintain his composure. Did she say anything to you, sweetie? He asked, his voice shaking. Sarah shook her head. No, but she looked sad. Like she wanted to tell me something, but couldn't. Ethan's mind raced. Was Sarah's grief causing her to imagine things, or was there something more to this? He couldn't shake the memory of her insistence at the funeral, that Lily wasn't in the coffin. His rational mind told him this was impossible, but doubt had begun to creep into the edges of his thoughts. I believe you, Sarah, he said softly, pulling her into a hug. I promise I'll figure out what's going on. Her small arms wrapped around his neck. You will, Daddy? She asked, her voice filled with hope. I will, Ethan assured her, though he wasn't sure how. Later that day, Ethan decided to investigate the garden himself. It was where Lily had spent most of her time, tending to her flowers and vegetables with a quiet passion. Ethan had always admired how her presence seemed to bring life to the space. Now it felt empty, a haunting reminder of her absence. As he walked through the rows of blooming flowers, his eyes scanned for anything unusual. His foot hit something buried beneath the soft earth, a piece of fabric. Kneeling down, he dug with his hands, pulling the material free. It was a scarf, one he recognized immediately. It was Lily's. The scarf was dirty but intact, and Ethan's heart raced as he held it. How did this get here? He muttered to himself. Lily had worn it the day before her sudden death, and it had been placed in the coffin with her. He was certain of that. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway startled him, and he stuffed the scarf into his pocket before heading back toward the house. When he reached the front yard, he saw his old friend Jake stepping out of his car. Jake was a local journalist with a knack for uncovering hidden truths, and Ethan had called him in desperation. Ethan, Jake said, his expression concerned. What's going on? Your call sounded urgent. Ethan gestured for him to follow, leading him inside and shutting the door behind them. Once seated in the living room, Ethan poured out everything. Sarah's claims, the sealed coffin, the coroner's evasive answers, and now the discovery of Lily's scarf in the garden. Jake listened intently, his face darkening as Ethan spoke. That's strange, Ethan, he said when his friend had finished. A sealed coffin without explanation, and now this scarf? Something doesn't add up. I know, Ethan said, his voice laced with frustration, but I don't know where to start. Every answer I try to find just raises more questions. Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. We could start with the coroner, he suggested. If anyone knows what's really going on, it's him. Ethan nodded. I already tried calling him. He was evasive, almost like he was hiding something. Jake smirked, his journalistic instincts kicking in. Then maybe it's time we pay him a visit. Ethan and Jake drove in tense silence toward the county coroner's office. The scarf weighed heavily in Ethan's pocket, a physical reminder of the questions swirling in his mind. Jake, ever the investigator, was already planning their approach. When they arrived, the small, nondescript building looked almost abandoned. The parking lot was empty except for a single car, and the blinds on the windows were drawn tightly shut. Jake adjusted his coat and nodded toward the door. Let me do the talking, he said. Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. They entered to find a young receptionist sitting behind a desk. She looked up from her computer with a polite but tired smile. Can I help you? She asked. Jake flashed his press badge. We're here to speak with Dr. Collins about a recent case he handled, he said smoothly. The receptionist hesitated, glancing nervously toward the back office. Dr. Collins is busy at the moment, she said. Can I take a message? Jake didn't miss a beat. It's regarding a sealed coffin in a high-profile case. I'm sure he'd want to make time for us. The receptionist blinked, her composure faltering. I'll check if he's available, she stammered before disappearing into the back. Ethan leaned toward Jake. High profile? He whispered. Jake shrugged. Sometimes you have to exaggerate to get answers. The receptionist returned moments later, visibly uneasy. Dr. Collins can see you now, she said, gesturing toward the hallway. They were led to a small office where Dr. Collins, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and glasses, sat behind a cluttered desk. He didn't rise to greet them. What is this about? He asked, his tone clipped. Jake wasted no time. We're here about the case of Lily Carter. Her husband, Ethan, has a few questions about the sealed coffin and the unusual instructions surrounding it. Collins stiffened, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. I don't discuss cases with the public, he said firmly. Ethan stepped forward, his voice trembling with frustration. That was my wife in that coffin, Dr. Collins. I deserve to know why it was sealed and why I wasn't allowed to see her. Collins avoided his gaze, his expression hardening. It's standard protocol in certain cases. There's nothing more to discuss. Jake leaned forward, his voice calm but probing. Standard protocol for what? There was no autopsy report provided to the family, no explanation. And now strange things are happening, things that suggest Lily might not even have been in that coffin. Collins' eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps, before he masked it with annoyance. This is ridiculous, he said, standing. I don't have time for conspiracy theories. Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. He pulled the scarf from his pocket and placed it on the desk. Explain this, he demanded. This was buried with Lily, but I found it in our garden yesterday. Collins' face drained of color. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the scarf, inspecting it as though it were a cursed object. He swallowed hard, setting it back down. I don't know how you got this, he said finally, his voice tight. But I advise you to let this go, for your own sake. Jake's eyes narrowed. Why? What are you hiding, Doctor? Collins? Collins didn't respond. Instead, he reached for a drawer in his desk and pulled out a sealed envelope, sliding it across the table. If you're going to dig, then you should know the truth, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But understand this. Knowing might only make things worse. Ethan hesitated before picking up the envelope. He opened it slowly, revealing a death certificate and a handwritten note. The certificate listed Lily's cause of death as undetermined, but it was the note that made his blood run cold. Keep the coffin sealed, it read, for the safety of the family. Ethan looked up, his heart pounding. What does this mean? Collins shook his head. I've said too much already. Please leave. Jake stood, his expression grim. We're not done here, Doctor. But Collins didn't reply. He simply sat back in his chair, his gaze distant, as though he were reliving something he desperately wanted to forget. As they walked out of the office, Ethan clutched the envelope tightly, his mind racing. "What does he mean by safety of the family?" he asked Jake. Jake frowned, his jaw set. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's bigger than we thought." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we have to find out the truth." Back at Ethan's house, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The envelope from Dr. Collins sat on the kitchen table, its contents spread out before Ethan and Jake. The words, "safety of the family," echoed in Ethan's mind, filling him with a dread he couldn't shake. "I need to know what's really going on," Ethan said, his voice low but determined. "Lily wouldn't just leave me with questions like this." Jake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "There's more to this than just the coroner's note. We need to dig deeper, but we have to be smart about it." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked over at the box of Lily's belongings that had been sitting untouched since the funeral. "Maybe there's something in her things," he said. "Something that explains all this." Jake nodded. "It's worth a shot. Let's start there." Ethan carried the box to the living room, carefully placing it on the coffee table. His hands trembled as he opened it, the scent of Lily's perfume still faintly clinging to the items inside. He pulled out a few pieces of clothing, a photo album, and a small leather-bound journal. His breath hitched as he held the journal. "Lily always kept this with her," he said quietly. "She used to write in it every night." Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "Then that's where we start." Ethan opened the journal, flipping through pages filled with Lily's neat handwriting. The entries were mundane at first, lists of groceries, notes about Matilda's school activities, and reflections on her day. But as he got further into the journal, the tone shifted. One entry, dated 3 weeks before her death, caught his eye. "Something feels wrong. I can't explain it, but I feel like I'm being watched. I keep seeing the same car parked near the house, and I swear I've heard footsteps outside the window at night. I don't want to worry Ethan, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm in danger." Ethan's hands tightened around the journal. "She was scared," he murmured. "She didn't tell me any of this." Jake leaned over to read the entry. "It gets worse," he said, pointing to a passage further down the page. "Today I found a note in the mailbox. It didn't have a name or return address. It just said, 'You can't run from the past.' I don't know what it means, but I feel like whoever sent it knows something about me, something I've tried to forget." Ethan's heart pounded as he flipped to the next entry, written 2 days later. "I thought I saw him today. Scott. It can't be, but what if it is? I've kept my secret for so long. I thought I was safe here, with Ethan and Matilda. But if Scott's found me, it's only a matter of time before everything falls apart. I need to protect them, no matter the cost." "Who's Scott?" Jake asked, his voice sharp. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. She never mentioned anyone by that name." Jake frowned, his brow furrowed. "It sounds like someone from her past, someone she was running from. We need to figure out who he is." Ethan flipped to the last entry in the journal, written the night before her death. "I saw him again. He was across the street, just standing there, watching the house. I don't know how he found me, but I can't let him hurt Ethan and Matilda. I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe, even if it means—" The entry ended abruptly, the rest of the page blank. Ethan stared at the words, his mind racing. "She knew something was going to happen," he said, his voice trembling. "She was trying to protect us." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. "And whatever she was protecting you from, it didn't end with her death." Ethan closed the journal, his hands shaking. "We need to find this Scott," he said. "He's the key to all of this." Jake placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We will," he said. "But we have to be careful. If Scott's as dangerous as Lily thought, we can't afford to make mistakes." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "I don't care how dangerous he is," he said. "I'm not stopping until I get answers." The next morning, Ethan and Jake began their search for Scott, starting with the little information they had from Lily's journal. Jake, being a detective, had access to resources that could help them dig deeper. He spent hours at the precinct, poring over databases and records, while Ethan stayed home, piecing together any clues from Lily's belongings. Late in the afternoon, Jake returned to Ethan's house, a folder in hand. His face was grim. "I found something," he said, setting the folder on the kitchen table. Ethan opened the folder, revealing a photograph of a man in his early 40s with dark hair and a hardened expression. Below the photo was a list of charges: fraud, theft, and connections to a string of criminal activities across several states. "This is Scott Walters," Jake said. "Lily's journal didn't give us much to go on, but I managed to trace the name and match it to this guy. He's been in and out of the system for years, but he's been off the radar for the past decade." Ethan stared at the photo, anger bubbling in his chest. "Why didn't she tell me?" he muttered. "Why didn't she trust me with this?" Jake leaned forward, his voice calm. "Maybe she thought she was protecting you. If this guy is as dangerous as he seems, she probably didn't want you to get involved." Ethan shook his head. "She didn't deserve to deal with this alone. And now she's gone because of him." Jake placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said. "I also found something else. Scott used to be associated with a group that ran operations out of a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's abandoned now, but it's worth checking out." Ethan nodded, determination replacing his anger. "Let's go." The warehouse was a hulking structure on the edge of a desolate industrial park. Its windows were shattered, and the metal siding was rusted and peeling. Ethan and Jake parked their car a block away, approaching the building cautiously. The air was thick with tension as they stepped inside, the faint smell of mildew and decay filling their nostrils. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows, and the floor was littered with debris, old newspapers, empty crates, and broken furniture. Jake led the way, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior. "Keep an eye out for anything unusual," he said. "This place might be abandoned, but that doesn't mean it's empty." Ethan nodded, his senses on high alert. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, they came across a small office in the corner of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and Jake pushed it open with the barrel of his flashlight. Inside, the office was cluttered but intact. A desk covered in papers and a filing cabinet stood against one wall, and a map of the city was pinned to a corkboard on the opposite wall. Jake began sifting through the papers on the desk while Ethan examined the map. "Look at this," Ethan said, pointing to several red pins stuck into the map. "These are all near our neighborhood." Jake frowned, stepping closer. "That's too much of a coincidence. He was watching you." Ethan's stomach churned as he realized the implications. "He was planning something," he said, "but what?" Jake pulled open the filing cabinet, rifling through the folders until he found one labeled with Lily's name. He handed it to Ethan, who opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photographs of Lily, Ethan, and Matilda, some taken from a distance, others up close. There were also notes scrawled in a messy hand, detailing their routines and habits. "He was stalking us," Ethan said, his voice shaking with rage. "He was planning something and she knew it." Jake's jaw tightened. "We need to take this to the authorities. This is evidence." As they turned to leave, a noise from the far end of the warehouse stopped them in their tracks. It was faint, a shuffle of footsteps followed by the creak of metal. Jake raised his flashlight, motioning for Ethan to stay behind him. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice steady. There was no response, only the sound of footsteps retreating. Jake and Ethan exchanged a glance before cautiously moving toward the source of the noise. In the shadows, they caught a glimpse of a figure slipping out through a side door. Jake sprinted after them, shouting for them to stop while Ethan followed close behind. They emerged into the alleyway, but the figure was gone, leaving only the echo of their footsteps behind. Jake cursed under his breath. "Whoever that was, they know we're onto them." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We're close, Jake. I can feel it. We're going to find him." Jake nodded, determination etched into his face. "And when we do, we'll make sure he answers for what he's done." The next morning, Ethan and Jake prepared for what they knew would be a dangerous confrontation. With the evidence they had gathered from the warehouse, Jake coordinated with local law enforcement to track Scott Walters' known whereabouts. The address they uncovered led them to a remote farmhouse at the edge of the city, a quiet, isolated place perfect for someone trying to stay hidden. Ethan and Jake drove in silence, the air between them heavy with anticipation. The farmhouse appeared on the horizon, a dilapidated structure with faded paint and boarded-up windows. A single car was parked in front, its tires caked in mud, indicating someone had been living there recently. Jake parked a short distance away, turning to Ethan. "Let me do the talking," he said firmly. "We don't know how this will go." Ethan nodded, but his eyes burned with resolve. "I just want answers." As they approached the farmhouse, Jake knocked on the door, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Scott Walters. He was older than the photo they had seen, but the same calculating eyes stared back at them. Scott's lips curled into a sly smile. "Well, well, what brings you boys out here?" Jake stepped forward, his tone professional but firm. "Scott Walters, we need to talk." Scott chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "Talk? About what?" Jake didn't flinch. "About Lily. About the threats you made and the life you tried to take from her." At the mention of Lily's name, Scott's expression hardened. "She made her choices," he said coldly. "She thought she could walk away from everything she did and live some perfect little life. Actions have consequences." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "She didn't deserve what you did to her," he said through gritted teeth. "You stalked her, threatened her, and now she's gone." Scott's eyes narrowed. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're implying." Jake stepped closer. "Then who did? Because everything points back to you." Scott laughed bitterly. "You think I wanted her dead? She was my leverage. As long as she was alive, I had control, but someone else wanted her gone, someone who saw her as a liability." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Who?" Scott hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's a man named Vincent Porter. He was involved in the same group Lily and I were part of years ago. He's ruthless, and he doesn't leave loose ends." Jake exchanged a glance with Ethan. "Where can we find him?" Scott shrugged. "Good luck. He's not the kind of guy who leaves breadcrumbs." Jake's patience wore thin. "You're coming with us," he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You've got a lot to answer for." Scott didn't resist as Jake cuffed him, his expression resigned. "You'll never get to Vincent," he muttered. "But if you're lucky, you might at least get some closure." Back at the precinct, Scott was booked, and Jake worked tirelessly with the evidence they had to build a case. Ethan sat in a quiet room, staring at the photo of Lily he carried in his wallet. His mind swirled with questions, but one thing was clear. He owed it to her and Matilda to see this through. A few days later, Jake called Ethan to the station. "We've tracked down Vincent Porter," he said. "He's in custody." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Did he admit to it?" Jake nodded. "He confessed to orchestrating everything, including the threats to Lily. He saw her as a risk because she knew too much." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of grief and relief. "She was trying to protect us," he whispered. Jake placed a hand on his shoulder. "And now justice will be served." In the weeks that followed, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life for Matilda. He made peace with the fact that some questions would never be answered, but he found comfort in knowing that Lily had fought to protect the people she loved. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching Matilda play in the yard, he felt a sense of calm for the first time in months. The truth had been uncovered, and though the pain of loss remained, he knew that Lily's love would always be with them. Jake pulled up in his car, stepping out with a small smile. "How are you holding up?" Ethan nodded. "We're getting there." Jake sat beside him, gazing out at the sunset. "Lily would be proud of you." Ethan smiled softly. "I hope so." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But with the support of those who loved him, he would keep moving forward, one step at a time.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.